I think I probably hold the world record for being threatened with a lawsuit by an HOA for trespassing on land my great-grandfather bought from the federal government in 1908. The story of how the president of the Azure Vista Homeowners Association tried to have me evicted from my own family cabin, only to find out she was a tenant in a kingdom I owned, is completely insane. So grab a drink, get comfortable, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because you are not going to believe how this suburban warfare saga ends. It all started, as these things often do, with the arrival of a brand new, pearl-white Cadillac Escalade that was far too clean for the gravel access road leading to my property. My cabin isn't much to look at from the outside, and that's by design. It's a simple, two-story structure of weathered cedar and riverstone tucked into a cove on the north shore of Blackwood Lake. My great-grandfather built it with his own hands. My grandfather added the big stone fireplace. My father expanded the deck. And I've spent the better part of my life maintaining it, upgrading the bones of the place while preserving its rustic soul. It's my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude, the one place on earth where the noise of my other life, the one filled with boardrooms, balance sheets, and quarterly reports fades into the whisper of wind through the 100-year-old pines. For most of my life, the only neighbors I had were deer, the occasional black bear, and a cranky old bald eagle that nested across the water. Then came Azure Vista. The development started about 5 years ago on the south side of the lake. A developer bought a huge parcel of old logging land and started putting up what they called luxury lakeside estates. I knew the developer, of course. They were leasing the land from one of my holding companies, a detail that will become critically important later. But I'm a big believer in letting people do their thing, so I watched from my deck as the McMansions began to sprout. They were huge, architectural monstrosities mostly, all sharp angles, glass walls, and beige stucco, completely at odds with the rugged landscape. They looked like a fleet of beige spaceships had crash-landed. Soon, the quiet hum of nature was replaced by the whine of leaf blowers and the distant thwack of tennis balls. I didn't love it, but the lake was big enough for all of us, or so I thought. The Escalade crunched to a halt about 50 feet from my porch. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a woman who looked like she was genetically engineered in a lab to be an HOA president. She was probably in her late 40s, rail-thin, with a blonde helmet of hair that looked like it could deflect small arms fire. She wore a blindingly pink velour tracksuit with the word "juicy" inexplicably emblazoned across the rear. In her hand, she clutched a clipboard like a weapon. This, I would soon learn, was Brenda Van Houten, the newly crowned queen of Azure Vista. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying a cup of coffee in the morning sun. I didn't get up. I just watched her march toward me, her expensive-looking white sneakers getting dusty. Her face was set in a mask of grim determination, the kind you see on people about to complain that their latte is only 180 degrees instead of the requested 185. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She stopped at the foot of my porch steps, looking up at me as if I were something she'd scraped off her shoe. "Are you the owner of this structure?" she asked, waving the clipboard vaguely at my cabin. "I am," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "And you are?" "I am Brenda Van Houten, president of the Azure Vista Homeowners Association," she announced, puffing out her chest. It was a title she delivered with the same gravity someone else might use for Her Royal Majesty, the Queen. "I'm here to deliver this." She snapped a piece of paper off the clipboard and held it out. I still didn't move. I just looked at her. After an awkward moment, she huffed and placed it on the bottom step. "This is an official notice of violation," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your property is not in compliance with Azure Vista community standards." This was news to me. "My property isn't part of Azure Vista," I stated simply. A smirk played on her lips. "All properties on or adjoining the lake are subject to the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the HOA. It's for the good of the community. It protects our property values." I had a feeling my property value was doing just fine. but I decided to play along. And what violations have I committed? She consulted her clipboard, her eyes narrowing with righteous fury. First, the unapproved exterior finish. All homes must be finished in approved shades of beige, taupe, or grayish. Your wood finish is non-compliant. I looked at my 100-year-old cedar siding weathered to a perfect silver gray. Second, your dock is an unpermitted structure extending into a community common area. The dock my grandfather built in 1947. Third, your landscaping is untamed and fails to meet aesthetic standards. She was talking about the ancient forest I lived in. And finally, that fishing boat, she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my old aluminum Lund, is not a permissible watercraft. All boats must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee, and frankly, that thing is an eyesore. I almost laughed. It was too absurd. It was like a penguin showing up in the Sahara to tell a camel it was wearing the wrong kind of fur. Ma'am, I said, finally putting my coffee mug down. With all due respect, you have no jurisdiction here. This property has been in my family for over a century. It predates your entire development by a few generations. Your HOA rules are as relevant to me as the rules of the local garden club. Her face flushed a blotchy red. She was not used to being contradicted. You are mistaken. Our legal documents are very clear. If you refuse to comply, fines will be levied. They start at $100 per day, per violation. She gave my cabin a disdainful once-over. So that's $400 a day. I'd advise you to start taking this seriously. Read the notice. With that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her Escalade, leaving the notice fluttering on my step. I waited until the dust from her exit had settled before I went down to pick it up. It was full of baffling legalese, citing bylaws and articles that sounded important but meant nothing. I read it, chuckled, and used it as kindling for my fire that evening. It was a mistake. I had assumed I was dealing with a rational person. I had failed to appreciate the sheer, glorious, weaponized pettiness of a woman like Brenda Van Houten. Over the next few weeks, the official-looking envelopes started arriving in my mailbox. First, it was just more notices, then invoices for the fines. Unpaid balance, 2,800, then 5,600, then a bold, red-stamped letter, threatening a lien on my property. I shredded them all. A few of the year-round Azure Vista residents I'd come to know on a nodding basis would give me sympathetic looks when I'd see them at the local market. One of them, a retired dentist named Arthur, stopped me in the produce aisle. "Be careful with that one," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "Brenda. She got a guy fined $3,000 because his trash cans were visible from the street for an hour too long. She calls herself the Queen of the Vista. Thinks she's a feudal lord." I thanked him for the warning, but I still wasn't worried. What could she really do? I owned my land outright. It was a recorded, deeded, legally unimpeachable fact. She was a gnat buzzing around my head. Annoying, but harmless. That's when she decided to prove me wrong, and in doing so, she kicked a hornet's nest she didn't even know existed. The second part of this insane saga began on a Tuesday morning. I woke up, went to the kitchen to make coffee, and found the faucet produced nothing but a sad, gurgling cough. The lights wouldn't turn on either. A quick check of the breaker box confirmed it wasn't an internal issue. The entire cabin was dead. My first thought was a downed line from a storm, but the sky was clear blue. I got in my truck and drove to the end of my access road, and that's when I saw it. A utility truck from Blackwood County Power. E-Water was pulling away from the pole that fed my property. I flagged them down. The lineman, a young guy named Dale whose father I'd gone to high school with, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Morning, sir," he said, avoiding my eyes. We got a work order." "A work order for what, Dale?" I asked. "To disconnect service at this address," he mumbled, shuffling his feet. "Said the account was illegitimate, something about an unpermitted dwelling." My blood ran cold for a second, then hot with a slow-burning anger I hadn't felt in years. "Who issued the order?" He winced. "Came through the main office, but the call was from a lady named Van Houten, from the new HOA. She said the HOA had authority over all utility hookups in the area and that yours was unauthorized. Brenda, of course. This was a breathtaking escalation. She hadn't just sent me a nasty letter. She had actively impersonated someone with authority and ordered a utility company to cut service to a private residence. This wasn't just petty tyranny anymore. This was flagrantly illegal. It was also, as she was about to discover, a monumental error in judgment. It was the strategic equivalent of trying to sink a battleship with a spitball. "All right, Dale. Thanks for letting me know," I said calmly. He looked relieved that I wasn't yelling at him. "You go on. I'll handle it." I got back in my truck, but instead of going back to the cabin, I pulled out my phone. I didn't call the generic customer service number. I have a different set of numbers for situations like this. I scrolled to a contact labeled Frank G. Frank Garrison is the president and CEO of North Star Utilities, the parent company of Blackwood County Power, Water. He's also on the board of 2 of my charitable foundations, and we play poker once a month. He answered on the second ring. "Frank, it's me," I said. "Hey, to what do I owe the pleasure? Don't tell me you're finally ready to sell me that antique generator from the old mill," he laughed. "Something a little different, Frank. I'm at my cabin on Blackwood Lake, and one of your crews just cut my power and water." There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. "Then, what? That's impossible. Your family's account is one of the oldest on our books. It's flagged for priority service. Let me make a call. I'll call you right back. 5 minutes." He called back in 3. His voice was a mixture of apoplectic rage and profound embarrassment. "I am so sorry," he began. "Some woman, a Brenda Van Houten, called our regional office, claimed to be an agent for the County Planning Commission, and stated your property had been condemned. She faxed over some forged documents. They looked official enough to fool a junior clerk, apparently. I've already got our legal team involved. The clerk has been suspended, and we're pursuing charges against this woman for fraud and impersonating an official. A crew is on its way back to you now with our senior supervisor. Your power will be on in 20 minutes, and your utility bills for the next 5 years are on me." "That's not necessary, Frank, but I appreciate it," I said. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again." "It won't," he promised grimly. "I can guarantee you that." As I sat there, waiting for the utility truck to return, I realized my passive approach had been a mistake. I had underestimated Brenda's malice. She wasn't just a power-tripping nuisance. She was a genuine threat, willing to commit actual crimes to get her way. The gnat had bitten me, and it was time to deploy the fly swatter. But my fly swatter wasn't just a single tool. It was an entire arsenal she couldn't begin to comprehend. That afternoon, I called George. George has been my lawyer for 30 years, a silver-haired shark in a Savile Row suit who finds deep intellectual joy in dismantling arrogant opponents. I laid out the whole story, from the first notice to the utility fiasco. He was quiet for a long time, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his brilliant legal mind. Finally, he chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "Oh, this is beautiful," he said. "This is exquisite. She has no idea, does she?" "Not a clue," I confirmed. "So how do you want to play this?" he asked. "We can send her a cease and desist that will make her hair ignite. We can sue her into the next geological era for what she did with the utilities. Or we can do something much more fun." "I'm listening," I said. "We let her escalate," George proposed, his voice full of theatrical relish. "We let her think she's winning. She's going to get angrier and angrier that her little tricks aren't working. Eventually, her ego will force her to do the one thing that will deliver her directly into our hands. She'll file a lawsuit. And once she does that, we get discovery. And through discovery, we will unspool a tapestry of humiliation so profound, she'll wish she'd never learned how to spell HOA. It was a deliciously vicious plan. And it was perfect. "Let's do it," I said. "But first, let's go on a little treasure hunt. I want to have all my ducks in a row, not just the big guns. I want every single duck. I want a veritable armada of ducks. The next day, I drove into town, not to the modern county government building, but to the old courthouse downtown, the one with the marble steps and the smell of old paper and floor wax. I went to the county clerk's office, a vast room with shelves of leather-bound ledgers stretching to the ceiling. The clerk, Martha, has been there for 45 years. Her father was the clerk before her, and he'd worked with my grandfather on establishing the town's first water district. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said with a warm smile, peering over her bifocals. "Don't tell me you're finally selling the old cabin." "Not a chance, Martha," I laughed. "I'm here on a research project. I need to see the original plat maps and deeds for the entire Blackwood Lake parcel. Everything, going back to the original land grant." Her smile widened. "Having some trouble with the new neighbors? I've heard stories." "You could say that," I admitted. For the next 5 hours, Martha and I were buried in history. We unrolled ancient, brittle maps. We carefully turned the pages of deed books, the elegant cursive of forgotten scribes detailing transactions in a world before computers, and we laid it all out on a massive table. The picture that emerged was overwhelming. My great-grandfather hadn't just bought the 10 acres my cabin sat on. Over the next 50 years, through the Great Depression and other downturns, he and my grandfather had strategically and quietly acquired almost everything. They bought the 40 acres of timberland that the developer was now leasing for Azure Vista. They bought the land under the lake itself, giving them riparian rights to the entire body of water. They bought the land for the access roads. It was all held in a series of trusts and shell companies established generations ago for tax and liability purposes, labyrinthine structures I'd modernized but kept intact. The developer of Azure Vista had done their due diligence, of course, but they'd only followed the paper trail back to Northwood Holdings, LLC, the entity they were paying their lease to. They had no reason to look further, no idea that the quiet man in the rustic cabin on the North Shore was the sole owner of Northwood Holdings, LLC. I didn't just own my cabin. I owned the land their houses were on. I owned the road they drove on. I owned the lake they so proudly advertised in their glossy brochures. Brenda Van Houten had picked a fight with her landlord, and she was about to try and evict him. Brenda, predictably, did not take her defeat with the utility company gracefully. Frank Garrison's legal team had sent her a letter that, I was told, was a masterpiece of controlled corporate fury. It outlined, in no uncertain terms, the state and federal crimes she had committed, and informed her that while the company was magnanimously choosing not to press criminal charges at this time, any further contact from her, for any reason, would result in her immediate introduction to the justice system. For most people, this would have been a wake-up call, a sign to retreat, apologize, and perhaps take up a less confrontational hobby, like macrame. But for Brenda, it was gasoline on the bonfire of her ego. Her attempt at a swift, covert strike had failed. Now, she was going to bring the full imagined weight of the Azure Vista HOA to bear. About a week later, a certified letter arrived. This one I didn't shred. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, Pittman, Skaggs, Howe, attorneys at law. Their letterhead looked like it had been designed in Microsoft Word 97. It was a formal cease and desist. It was, even for a cheap lawyer, an impressively sloppy piece of work. It claimed my cabin was an illegal and unpermitted structure, that my dock was an unlawful encroachment upon the common property of the Azure Vista HOA, and that my very presence constituted a private nuisance that was actively harming the aesthetic and financial value of the community. It demanded that I immediately vacate the property and remove all structures within 30 days. Failure to comply, the letter blared in an underlined, bold font, would result in a lawsuit seeking my forcible removal, demolition of the cabin at my expense, and punitive damages to the tune of $500. I scanned it, then read it again slowly, savoring the spectacular wrongness of it all. They were threatening to sue me for trespassing on my own land, based on authority they didn't have, over a lake they didn't own. It was perfect. I faxed a copy to George with a simple, two-word note. It's on. George's strategy was one of calculated silence. We wouldn't respond to the letter. We would ignore it completely. Let them stew, he advised. Let them think you're scared. Let them get confident. The first move in a chess game like this should be to let your opponent knock over their own king. So, I went about my business. I went fishing. I repaired a section of the porch railing. I enjoyed the peace and quiet, which was now tinged with the sweet anticipation of the coming storm. Meanwhile, I wasn't idle. Brenda had escalated to using the law, so I would prepare for war. The first step was surveillance. I had a security contractor I use for my commercial properties come out. These guys were pros, ex-special forces. Within a day, my property was outfitted with a network of tiny, discreet, high-definition cameras, all motion-activated and feeding to a secure cloud server. They were virtually invisible, hidden in tree bark, birdhouses, and rock formations. I wanted a complete, undeniable record of everything that happened on my land. It didn't take long to pay off. 2 nights later, around 11 p.m., my phone pinged with a motion alert. I pulled up the feed and watched, mesmerized. It was Brenda. She had parked her Escalade up the road and crept down my access lane on foot, accompanied by 2 men I recognized from the HOA board meetings I'd seen advertised on the community bulletin board. One was a weedy little man named Gary, the HOA treasurer. The other was a big, beefy guy named Stan, who ran the architectural review committee. They were armed with flashlights and a camera, trespassing with the kind of clumsy stealth you see in bad spy movies. They took pictures of my cabin, my boat, my woodpile. At one point, Brenda, emboldened, crept onto my dock and tried to untie my fishing boat. The knot my father taught me held firm. She gave up after a minute, muttering something I couldn't hear but could guess the tone of. The footage was crystal clear, date and time stamped. It was beautiful. The next phase was intelligence. While George prepared for the inevitable lawsuit, I wanted to know more about my adversary. I engaged a private investigator, a discreet professional named Marcus who usually helped me with corporate due diligence. I asked him to do a deep dive on Brenda Van Houten. I want to know everything, I told him. Financial history, legal history, where she buys her tracksuits, everything. Marcus delivered his report a week later. It was a fascinating portrait of insecurity and desperation. Brenda and her husband, it turned out, were mortgaged to the hilt. The Escalade was leased. The house in Azure Vista was financed with a risky adjustable-rate mortgage. They were living far beyond their means, projecting an image of wealth that was as fake as the gold trim on their faucets. Even more telling was her legal history. Marcus found she had been involved in 3 prior lawsuits. One against a dry cleaner for emotional distress over a supposedly ruined blouse. One against a neighbor in their previous community over a barking dog. And one against a grocery store after she slipped on a grape she had likely dropped herself. She had lost all 3 cases. She wasn't a master strategist. She was a litigious bully who used the legal system as a tool for harassment. Her HOA presidency wasn't about community. It was about wielding the only power she'd ever had. My final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. A man named Carlos, who ran a local landscaping company, came to my door one afternoon, hat in hand. He looked nervous. I'd seen his trucks around Azure Vista. "Sir," he said, "I need to apologize. And to warn you." I invited him to sit on the porch. He told me that Brenda had ordered him and his crew to go onto my property and clear-cut a 20-foot-wide fire break along our shared property line. She had claimed it was an HOA mandate for fire safety. Carlos, knowing this was my land, had refused. He told her he couldn't perform work on private property without the owner's consent. Brenda had flown into a rage, fired his company on the spot, and threatened to ruin his reputation with every other homeowner in the development. "She's crazy," Carlos said, shaking his head. "She told me she was going to get you one way or another. I've got 3 kids, sir. I can't get involved in a legal thing. But I wanted you to know. I'll sign an affidavit, a statement, whatever you need. What she's doing isn't right." I thanked him profusely and assured him I'd make sure his business didn't suffer. In fact, I hired him on the spot to do some erosion control work for me down by the lake, on a contract that would more than make up for losing the HOA's business. He left looking immensely relieved. I now had video evidence of her trespassing, a detailed financial and legal background, and a sworn witness to her attempts to illegally damage my property. The trap was set. All the pieces were in place. All I had to do was wait for Brenda to walk into it. And true to form, she did not disappoint. The official summons arrived 2 weeks later. The Azure Vista Homeowners Association versus John Doe, they didn't even know my name, the lawsuit had been filed. The game was afoot. The lawsuit filed by Pittman Skaggs Howe on behalf of the Azure Vista HOA was a work of art, if your preferred art form is delusional fiction. It was a sprawling, 30-page document filled with baseless accusations, hysterical claims of damages, and a fundamental misunderstanding of property law that was almost poetic in its incompetence. It formally requested an injunction from the court to force my removal from the property, demanded the right to demolish my cabin and bill me for it, and asked for $500,000 in punitive damages for the irreparable harm my rustic cabin was inflicting on the delicate sensibilities of the beige stucco enthusiasts of Azure Vista. George read it with an expression of pure, unadulterated glee. It was like watching a master chef inspect a prize-winning truffle. "They've done it," he said, tapping the document with his finger. "They have built their own gallows and are now arguing over who gets to pull the lever first. They've claimed ownership of the lake. They've asserted authority based on the HOA covenants. They have, officially, in a court of law, made these claims. This is better than I could have hoped." Our response was simple and devastatingly understated. We accepted service. We filed a formal answer denying every single allegation. And then George filed our own set of motions, the most important of which was a notice to take the deposition of the plaintiff's representative, Miss Brenda Van Houten. This, George explained, was the main event. It was the arena where our quiet, patient preparation would collide with her loud, arrogant ignorance. The deposition was scheduled to take place at George's office in the city. It was a beautiful, intimidating space on the 40th floor, all glass and steel with a panoramic view of the skyline. We made sure to book the largest conference room, the one with the 20-foot-long mahogany table that had a habit of making people feel very, very small. I attended, as was my right, but sat at the far end of the table next to George, saying nothing. My instructions were to be a silent, observant ghost. Brenda arrived with her lawyer, Mr. Pittman. He was a small, sweaty man whose suit looked 2 sizes too big for him. He was visibly nervous, constantly fiddling with his cheap briefcase. Brenda, on the other hand, was radiating smug confidence. She was dressed for battle in a sharp, navy blue pantsuit with shoulders that looked like they belonged on a 1980s linebacker. She sat down opposite George, gave me a triumphant little smirk, and arranged her files with an air of great importance. The court reporter swore her in. George began his questioning in a calm, almost sleepy tone. For the first hour, he asked her simple, foundational questions. He had her confirm her name, her position as HOA president, and her authority to act on behalf of the board. He had her identify the HOA's founding documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. He was building the foundation of her case for her, brick by brick. With every answer, her confidence grew. She was eloquent, forceful, and completely sure of herself. "Miss Van Houten," George said, leaning forward slightly, "could you please describe for the record the geographic area governed by the Azure Vista HOA?" "Certainly," she said, beaming. "It encompasses the entirety of the Azure Vista Estates development, including all residential lots, as well as all common areas." "And what do those common areas include?" George asked, his voice still gentle. "They include our clubhouse, the tennis courts, the private access roads, and of course, Blackwood Lake itself," she declared with a pointed glance in my direction. "So, to be clear for the record, the Azure Vista HOA owns and controls Blackwood Lake?" That is correct, she said firmly. It is our principal community asset. Mr. Pittman, her lawyer, was starting to look a little green. He was a bottom feeder, not an idiot, and some primal instinct seemed to be telling him that his client was gleefully tap-dancing through a minefield. George nodded slowly, making a note on his legal pad. Excellent. And the authority to enforce your covenants against my client, where does that authority come from? It comes from the Master Declaration for the Community, Brenda said. It applies to all properties within and adjacent to the development. His property is adjacent. Therefore, he is subject to our rules. So, the Master Declaration is the supreme document here? Its authority is absolute in this matter? George pressed. Absolutely, she confirmed. George smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a crocodile that has just seen a wildebeest wander into the river. Wonderful, he said. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, bound document. He slid it down the long mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of her. Ms. Van Houten, I present you with what has been marked as Defense Exhibit A. This is a certified copy of the Master Declaration for Azure Vista Estates you just referred to. Could you please turn to page 12, Article 4, Section 2. Brenda eagerly flipped through the pages. Her lawyer, Pittman, leaned over her shoulder, a look of growing dread on his face. She found the section and looked up, expectantly. Please read the first sentence of that section aloud for the record, George instructed. She cleared her throat and began to read. The entirety of the property described herein, known as Azure Vista Estates, is subject to a 99-year master land lease agreement with the lessor, Northwood Holdings, LLC. She stopped. The words hung in the air. She reread the sentence to herself, her lips moving silently. The triumphant smirk had vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Thank you, George said smoothly. Now, Ms. Van Houten, are you familiar with an entity by the name of Northwood Holdings, LLC? I am not, she stammered, the first crack in the armor. You're not? George feigned surprise. That's odd. Given that, according to this document, your entire community is essentially a long-term tenant of this entity. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a second, much thinner document. He slid it across the table. This is Defense Exhibit B. It is the Articles of Organization for Northwood Holdings, LLC, as filed with the Secretary of State. Could you please read the name of the sole managing member, listed on page 1? Her hands were trembling slightly as she picked it up. Her eyes scanned the page. The color drained from her face. I could see the exact moment the blood turned to ice water in her veins. She looked up from the paper, her gaze locking with mine for the first time that day. Her expression was one of pure, uncomprehending horror. She didn't say a word. For the record, George said into the profound silence, the sole managing member of Northwood Holdings, LLC, is my client, the gentleman sitting next to me. Pittman made a choking sound, like he'd swallowed his own tongue. But George wasn't finished. He was just getting started. One by one, he produced the exhibits. Exhibit C, the original 1923 deed, granting the entire bed of Blackwood Lake to my grandfather. Exhibit D, the corporate charter for Blackwood County Power Water, showing my family as the majority shareholders since its inception. Exhibit E, the sworn affidavit from Carlos, the landscaper. And finally, Exhibit F, a USB drive. And this, Ms. Van Houten, George said, holding up the drive, contains approximately 3 hours of high-definition video, time-stamped 2 weeks ago, showing you and 2 of your board members trespassing on my client's private property in the middle of the night. There's a particularly interesting segment where you are seen attempting to unlawfully interfere with his boat. Brenda looked like she had been physically struck. She was pale, gasping for air. Her lawyer, Pittman, just slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. He was muttering, "Oh no, oh no, 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 no." He knew. He knew he had committed malpractice on a scale that would get him disbarred, sanctioned, and possibly laughed out of the state. He had filed a frivolous, baseless lawsuit against the man who owned the very ground his clients lived on. He hadn't just brought a knife to a gunfight. He had brought a water pistol to a tactical nuclear strike. George leaned back in his chair. "So, Ms. Van Houten?" he said, his voice now cold and hard as granite. "Let's go back to your earlier statement. Could you please explain to the court, one more time, how exactly my client is trespassing?" The deposition ended, for all practical purposes. At that moment, the ensuing chaos was a sight to behold. Mr. Praz, Pittman, her lawyer, immediately requested a recess, practically dragging a catatonic Brenda Van Houten out of the conference room. From the hallway, I could hear his panicked, high-pitched whispers, thick with the stench of terror and desperation. They were in there for 20 minutes. When they returned, Pittman looked like a man who had aged a decade. Brenda looked utterly broken. Her pantsuit seemed to sag, its sharp shoulders now looking like sad, deflated balloons. The Queen had been deposed, and she knew it. "My client," Pittman began, his voice a hoarse croak, "and the Azure Vista HOA wished to withdraw their lawsuit immediately, with prejudice." With prejudice meant they could never file it again. It was the legal equivalent of a complete and total surrender. George held up a hand. "Not so fast, counselor," he said calmly. "You don't get to throw a bomb into my client's life, force him to spend tens of thousands of dollars on a legal defense for a suit you knew, or should have known, was completely baseless, and then just walk away when you get caught." He turned his gaze to me. "My client has been harassed, his property has been trespassed upon, his utilities were illegally disconnected due to your client's fraudulent actions, and his character has been defamed. We will accept your withdrawal of this ridiculous lawsuit, but this is not over. We will be filing a countersuit for malicious prosecution, trespass, slander of title, and seeking full restitution of all legal fees, plus significant punitive damages. We will be naming the HOA as a corporate entity, and Ms. Van Houten and her trespassing associates personally, as defendants. You can expect service within 48 hours. Pittman didn't even try to argue. He just nodded miserably, gathered his papers, and shuffled out of the room, his now shattered client trailing silently behind him. The air in the conference room felt clean again. George and I sat there for a moment in the silence. Then he let out a long, satisfied sigh. "Well," he said with a broad grin, "I think that went rather well." Word of the deposition and the impending countersuit spread through Azure Vista like a wildfire in a dry canyon. Someone on the inside, probably the weedy treasurer Gary, who had been on the midnight trespassing adventure with Brenda, leaked the core details to the other homeowners. The story was just too good, too catastrophic, to keep secret. The quiet guy in the old cabin wasn't just some stubborn recluse. He was their landlord. Their ultimate, invisible, all-powerful landlord. The reaction was a predictable mix of shock, terror, and fury, directed squarely at one Brenda Van Houten. An emergency HOA meeting was called for that Saturday. The flyer, slipped under every door in the development, was practically screaming with panic. The meeting was to be held at the community clubhouse, a building I technically owned but had never set foot in. I decided it was time to make an appearance. I wasn't going to hide on my side of the lake anymore. I asked George to come with me. He accepted with the enthusiasm of a man who's been invited to the premiere of a movie he both wrote and directed. We walked in together. The room was packed. Every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls. The air was thick with tension and anger. When the crowd saw me, a hush fell over the room. They all knew who I was now. I was the ghost who had suddenly materialized. I found a seat in the back and just sat there, my expression neutral. My mere presence was a statement. Brenda was at the podium, looking haggard. Her husband sat in the front row, staring intently at his shoes, as if they held the secrets of the universe. The HOA board members sat at a table next to her, each one looking like they were waiting for a firing squad. Brenda tapped the microphone and tried to take control, but her voice was thin and shaky. She started talking about unforeseen legal complexities and misunderstandings. It was a weak, pathetic attempt to spin an unspinnable disaster. The homeowners weren't having it. After about 2 minutes of her blathering, a man in the third row stood up. "Misunderstandings?" he shouted. "You sued our landlord. You exposed all of us to a massive lawsuit because of your personal vendetta. Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost us?" The dam broke. People started yelling from all corners of the room. They were angry about their property values, about the potential for a massive special assessment to cover the legal damages, about being lied to. It was a full-blown mutiny. Brenda tried to shout over them, but she was drowned out. It was a complete and total public humiliation. After a few minutes of chaos, George stood up. He didn't shout. He just stood there, his calm, authoritative presence cutting through the noise. The room gradually fell silent. "If I may," he said, his voice filling the space effortlessly. "My name is George St. Clair. I am the attorney for the gentleman you all know as your neighbor." He gestured to me. "Perhaps I can clarify the situation." For the next 10 minutes, George calmly and methodically laid out the facts. He explained the land lease. He explained my family's multi-generational ownership of the lake and the surrounding land. He explained the illegal actions taken by Ms. Van Houten. And he explained the countersuit. He made it clear that we weren't suing the homeowners individually. Our suit was directed at the corporate entity of the HOA for the gross negligence of its leadership, and at Brenda and her cohorts personally for their malicious actions. When he finished, you could have heard a pin drop. The homeowners just stared, their faces a canvas of dawning comprehension. They finally understood the full scope of the catastrophe their president had created. The man who had been called a nuisance and an eyesore held the fate of their entire community in his hands. The weedy treasurer, Gary, was the first to break. He stood up, trembling, and announced his immediate resignation from the board. Stan, the architectural enforcer, quickly followed suit. The rest of the board members looked at each other in panic, then resigned in a domino-like cascade of cowardice. Within 5 minutes, the entire HOA board had dissolved, leaving Brenda standing alone at the podium, abandoned by her enablers. Her husband had, at some point, managed to slip out a side door. A motion was made from the floor by a homeowner to remove Brenda Van Houten as president. It was seconded by a dozen voices at once. The vote was unanimous. She was stripped of her title, her power, her entire reason for being in that room. Defeated and alone, she gathered her papers and, without a word, walked out of the clubhouse. No one watched her go. All eyes were on me. In the end, it was resolved cleanly. The HOA's insurance company, faced with the mountain of undeniable evidence, settled our countersuit quickly. They paid out a sum that was, let's just say, substantial. It covered George's fees, with quite a bit left over. I took the entire settlement amount and created the Blackwood Lake Conservation Trust, an endowment dedicated to preserving the water quality and natural environment of the area for generations to come. The first act of the trust was to hire Carlos's landscaping company on a permanent basis. A new, chastened HOA board was eventually elected. Their first official act was to draft a formal, written apology to me. Their second was to amend their bylaws to explicitly state that my property was exempt from any and all HOA rules, now and forever. I met with the new president, a reasonable woman who was an engineer at a tech company. We established a clear and respectful relationship. They were my tenants, in a way, and I was their neighbor. We had to coexist. Brenda and her husband put their house up for sale a month later. In a market where houses were selling in days, theirs sat for 6 months. The story was just too well known. They finally sold it at a significant loss to a couple from out of state who hadn't heard the gossip. The last I saw of her, she was driving her pearl-white Escalade away from Azure Vista for the last time, her face a mask of bitter defeat. I felt a small, grim sense of satisfaction. Not joy, but the quiet contentment that comes from seeing a bully finally face the consequences of their actions. The lake is quiet again. The loudest sounds are the call of the loons and the whisper of the wind through the pines. I never wanted a fight. I just wanted to be left alone in my sanctuary. But Brenda Van Houten taught me a valuable lesson. Sometimes, The only way to protect your peace is to be willing to go to war. And it helps, of course, if you own the battlefield. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.